Welcome to the Electric Wire Podcast. We bring you news and views on the most pressing issues facing Wisconsin's electric industry, from policymakers, executives, and customer and environmental advocates. Bringing you these discussions, we are the Customers First Coalition. Here's your host, Executive Director Kristin Gilkes.
Great. Welcome to the Electric Wire Podcast. I'm your host, Kristin Gilkes, and I am joined today by Alex Moe, who is a reporter for WisBusiness and host of WisBusiness, the podcast. Welcome to the Electric Wire, Alex.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Alex and I just recorded, I did an interview for the WisBusiness podcast, so I asked him to come over here and join me on the Electric Wire as well, because WisBusiness and WisPolitics have recently been producing a series in a Spotlight on Energy series. And so I thought this series would be of some interest to our listeners. So Alex, why don't you tell me a little bit more about your Spotlight on Energy series?
Absolutely. Happy to. And thanks so much for having me on your show, Kristin. This article coming out of Wisconsin really is focused on some recent developments around nuclear energy. And as you said, it's part of this Spotlight on Energy series, a series of stories from State Affairs. That's a national network of state-level newsrooms, including here in Wisconsin, WisPolitics and WisBusiness. So, as I mentioned, the story in Wisconsin is really looking at what I would describe as a resurgence of interest and activity around nuclear energy here in the state, which was really interesting to learn about it and speak with people about, because we're seeing, just in this last legislative session here in Wisconsin, multiple proposals that got bipartisan interest and traction in the legislature. And we can talk more in detail about those in a bit, I'm sure. But Governor Evers also has signed some, I would say, maybe more minor legislation into law that pertains to nuclear pretty recently. So this is all happening at the same time as, there's greater interest and concern, I think, about the greater burden on the energy grid from data centers and other sources. So all of that is one piece of the story. And then the other piece is looking at a project in northeastern Wisconsin to basically restart nuclear energy production at the site of a former nuclear plant in Kewaunee County in the town of Carlton. That's been decommissioned offline for the past dozen years or so. And now the company that owns the site has been working on breaking it down, has submitted documents and kind of started this process of firing up nuclear there again. So it'll be interesting to see how that project plays out. But just looking at the beginning of that effort, as well as the broader political momentum and will, was really my focus. So happy to get into all of that.
Thanks, Alex. No, I think it's really cool that you were able to contribute this sort of like spotlight on nuclear in Wisconsin to this broader series that spans multiple states in the State Affairs Network, and just kind of showcase what's happening here in Wisconsin. I do think it is unique and sort of cool that there is so much bipartisan support around nuclear power in Wisconsin. There's a lot of research being done here, a lot of like business startups happening here. And I think that was part of what Governor Evers signed, is they're going to host this summit in a couple of years, 2028 maybe, about, what's happening here in Wisconsin. As you were writing your article, did you learn any more about some of these efforts that are currently happening here?
Yes. I don't know exactly when that summit is going to be happening, but as you mentioned, that was the subject of one of the bills Governor Evers signed into law, just really continuing the conversation around nuclear. I think that acknowledges the fact that policymakers and others are really keen to dig into this issue and talk about it more. And the other bill that Evers signed on nuclear authorized a nuclear power siting study. And that's happening with experts at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as the State Public Service Commission, the state's utility regulating agency, are going to be working together on this study to explore, I think, the potential for new nuclear production at different sites around the state. So again, another interesting project that'll be cool to see how it plays out in the months and years to come.
Yes. I was going to ask you, you did some pretty extensive interviews for the article that you wrote. You interviewed Paul Wilson at the UW, as well as a Republican lawmaker Rep Sortwell and a Democratic lawmaker, Representative Subek, who, spoke to you at length about some of the sort of the political implications on both sides of the aisle in getting more legislation passed. There were a couple bills out there that didn't make it across the finish line this session. So I'm wondering if you can tell me more about what you heard from those lawmakers and what you think some of the hurdles would be to getting more legislation passed in Wisconsin down the road.
I do think that the lawmakers I spoke with, as you mentioned, Representative Sortwell and Subek as well, talked about the bipartisan element of this because obviously so often in Wisconsin we run into issues of finding, I think, political shared ground between our two parties. Wisconsin's a purple state, people like to say, and it's cool to see an issue where at least to some extent both parties are somewhat on board, which I think is the most you can say. But, like Professor Wilson talked about in our conversation, nuclear energy has a lot to recommend it, is how he described it. And, I think that's definitely true and definitely plays into how policymakers and lawmakers in the state are talking about nuclear. Because nuclear, the view and vibe around it has shifted over years. There were, fears and concerns in decades past about nuclear disasters, obviously. There's been high profile evidence of that in history. And then the concerns about nuclear waste. But I think all of those are really secondary right now to the broader concerns about the energy demands of the grid. So I
Mhm.
think policymakers are open to at least opening the door to talking about nuclear as an interesting option, right? Like among Democrats, the renewable resources, clean energy resources are more popular. Among Republicans, the classic fossil fuels, I think, generally get more political support. With natural gas, there's the environmental concern linked to fracking. That's a whole separate complex conversation. But nuclear is clean, but highly expensive, right? As you alluded to. So I think that is the biggest hurdle and kind of the target for some of the legislation that's been coming out in Wisconsin, which is to propose tax credits and things to kind of make this more palatable, more affordable, as the state seeks to meet its rising energy demand. Professor Wilson had some great insights. I've heard him speak multiple times about nuclear energy in the state, and there's a lot of interesting possibilities for the kind of technology, for example, that could be used at Kewaunee. So there's a lot of questions, I think, remaining in the air, and I think lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are interested in answering those questions about how this industry is going to evolve in the coming years. But yeah, it was just pretty eye-opening to chat with folks on both sides of the aisle and hear some of the same things coming from both sides.
Yeah, it sounded like in reading some of the quotes from the lawmakers in your article that there is, even though some of the tax credit bills this year did not make it across the finish line, there's interest in continuing to work on that down the road. So I don't think you've heard the last on that.
Definitely.
I'm curious, just to switch gears slightly, at WisBusiness and as part of your podcast, I think you probably get to talk to a lot of really interesting business leaders from across the state and write about a lot of different sectors of our economy. And I'm just curious, what else do you hear on energy issues? Anything stick out to you, that you're currently hearing a lot about that's important to the business community?
That's a really good question. I would say that as far as in the podcast, there haven't been any recent interviews that delve deeply onto energy issues. The podcast that I do explores conversations with folks from all across the spectrum of the state's economy. And I don't know great insights on energy jump out to me, to be honest with you, but I do
Yeah.
just in my day-to-day reporting, because the WisBusiness podcast is part of what we do. We have a subscriber news service focused on business in Wisconsin. And a major topic that gets discussed a lot is the data center concerns around energy. I think that is the dominating topic in the news right now around energy concerns. And I haven't had the chance to dig into that deeply on the podcast yet, but I would love that
Yeah.
opportunity. And I've been really trying to um, get a little bit deeper than maybe what's been just announced in like press releases by businesses, developers involved in projects like these. But it's been challenging, honestly. I think the
Yeah.
companies that are involved in a lot of these projects are really playing their cards close to the chest, and maybe for good reason, given the political environment. Recent political polling has shown that Wisconsinites are pretty dubious about the value of data centers in general. And that kind of runs counter to a lot of the narrative from folks who are advocates for these projects. So yeah, not something I've explored yet in the podcast, but it's something that we're exploring a lot in our news coverage at WisBusiness, and the ongoing discussion over that is there's a lot more to come on that.
It has completely flipped the script in the energy industry. We were going from literal decades of a decline in energy usage because of energy efficiency and just, new technologies. And now there's explosive growth. And I think there are opportunities to use that growth to help pay for needed grid upgrades. And at the Public Service Commission, they're going to be, examining these dockets closely. But in some other states, the utilities have come out and said, because of data centers, we're going to be filing for a rate decrease for all customers. So it'll be interesting to see if that ever starts to play out here, or if some of these promises could come to fruition, that because of the increased load, all customers may benefit. So remains to be seen.
Right, absolutely. I think that some people in Wisconsin might be hesitant or coming into these conversations with a cynical view, given some high profile companies sort of like falling through on their promises to the state. Like Foxconn obviously springs to mind in
Mhm.
recent memory. So I do think that there are reasons to there's reasons you can point to and say, hey, this is driving some of the cynicism and concern. And for folks who are carrying this message, obviously that's their hurdle, that's their challenge to deal with.
Agreed. Okay. I know WisBusiness and WisPolitics are maybe parallel and sometimes intersecting entities, but I'm curious, we talked a little bit about the thoughts of your the business community that you speak with on energy issues, but I'm curious if you all have thoughts about how energy issues and this kind of increased interest in energy issues, how that may be playing out in the upcoming midterm elections.
That's a really good question and a really complex, nuanced answer to that question. Um, I think would be helpful to a lot of people right now as they, work on election platforms and campaigning. I think that it is going to play a role, especially, at the local level. The question I think is it going to play into these bigger state level elections? And I wish I had more insight about like how these specific issues are going to be impacting the electorate, but I think that the issues are certainly impacting the rhetoric and the way that
Yes.
that candidates are talking about the economy. You hear about gas prices, the price of milk and eggs. Well, you also hear about your monthly electric bill a lot more now from politicians, and I
Mhm.
think you may be used to, at least from my perspective. And I think that energy will play into the election to the extent to what extent it will, that's hard to say. Certainly affordability is going to be a big factor in this election. And as we kind of talked about earlier, oftentimes energy costs, your energy bill gets wrapped into this broader question and issue of affordability. Most average Wisconsinites, most average Americans probably don't have a full grasp on where, what are all the different factors, and why would they, of why their energy costs might change, but it gets grouped into this broader conversation. So I think to the extent that energy cost contributes to these concerns around affordability, that will be something that voters might be paying attention to, giving the increased attention on data centers and what we've discussed already.
Yep, absolutely. Well, we'll be watching it and we'll be reading WisPolitics and WisBusiness, listening to the podcast throughout the next couple months and see how these issues start to take shape. Alex, anything else you wanted to close out with, or anything else from your article on nuclear that you wanted to discuss?
No, it's a good question. No, I would circle back, I think, to a conversation that I had with the town of Carlton uh, chairman, who, he shared some insights about how locals are feeling about this effort to bring back nuclear in Kewaunee County. That's David Hartke, the town chairman for Carlton, and he basically just said that the locals, as long as they're not bringing a data center here, they're happy
Wow.
with it. And he specified that, they want to see nuclear come back. So you talked about the community level concrete impact of the plant leaving more than a decade ago. I just wanted to circle back to that as we end our conversation to emphasize that these projects are happening within Wisconsin communities. And, the view of locals about these projects are really important. And I think the developers and companies involved in them are paying close attention to that. And the rest of us should too, as folks who care about the state's energy industry and economy more broadly. So I would say that keeping that local focus and that local understanding is important for my work. And I hope to continue that going forward.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks for bringing that up. They've experienced the benefits that the nuclear plant can bring to the community. And I mean, there was a lot of jobs created and a lot of revenue for the township and the county through the years. So I'm sure, having experienced that, they know that there can be a benefit to the community from the nuclear facilities there. And so it's interesting that they're willing to embrace some of those benefits, but in a very specific way. All right, great. Well, thank you so much again, Alex, for joining. And of course, we will link in the show notes to the article we've been referencing about the effort to revive the Kewaunee County site, as well as the WisBusiness podcast, and your website.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me on the show.
All right. Thanks again, Alex.
Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. Please support our work. You can subscribe to the Electric Wire podcast if you haven't already, and you can follow us on Twitter at The Electric Wire. Thanks also to the members of the Customers First Coalition for supporting this podcast. Our members are Dairyland Power Cooperative, Madison Gas and Electric, the Municipal Electric Utilities of Wisconsin, WPPI Energy, the Citizens Utility Board, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Local 2150, and the Wisconsin Electric Cooperatives Association. Thanks again for listening. We'll have a new episode next month.